Okay, so now that we've gotten that context from the data we just saw, we're going to do an overview of the identities that fall under the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And before I get into some definitions, I just want to preface by saying that I use the phrase sexual identity instead of sexual orientation or sexuality, just because I personally think it's the most inclusive. So just wanted to give you a little heads up on that. So, it's important to first make the distinction between gender and sexual identity. So, that might sound a little silly because, in theory, they are very different parts of who we are. But there can sometimes be some confusion about just potential overlap or specific distinctions between the two. So, these definitions that I have here on this slide are from the Human Rights Campaign, which is another reputable LGBTQ plus rights organization. And so, as you can see, the gender definition is one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both or neither, how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. One's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. And then for sexual identity, an inherent or immutable, enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. Note, an individual's sexual orientation is independent of their gender identity. So just to reiterate what the definitions just said, these two identities are completely independent of each other, even though both types of identities can be covered under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. So just wanted to set the stage there before we get going into these other definitions. So as you can see on this next slide, you can see the terms that make up each letter of the LGBTQ plus acronym. These letters include both sexual identities and gender identities. And so before I show you the definition of each, I'd like to consider which ones you feel familiar with, which ones you're unsure of the definition, or which ones you're wanting to learn more about. So please be thinking about that as I share. Just take a few moments to consider which ones you feel familiar with and which ones that you want more clarity on that hopefully these definitions help provide for you. So same thing, I got these definitions from the Human Rights Campaign as well. And I actually made some slight adjustments to some of the definitions just to reflect some more modern adaptations or evolution that's occurred with some of the terms pretty recently. So we'll start with the definition of lesbian. I want to emphasize that a lesbian isn't necessarily a woman who is attracted to another woman, as we've previously seen in recent history. But the definition is actually expanded recently to cover anyone who identifies as a non-man. So that could be a cis female or even non-binary folks, for example, who is attracted to another non-man. Next, we have gay, which historically has been thought of as a man who is attracted to another man, but has actually become more of an umbrella term since it essentially is a person who's attracted to someone of the same gender. And an umbrella term, just in case you aren't sure of what that means, just means a term that covers a wide range of identities instead of just one specific one. So you'll hear me use that term several times coming up. Next, bisexual refers to someone who is attracted to two or more genders. Historically, this term has been seen as someone who's attracted to men and women, but that's not always the case. So this is another little evolution that's happened here. And another slight distinction is that someone might identify as pansexual, which can mean that someone is attracted to all genders, or that their attraction for someone is regardless of the other person's gender. So that's just kind of a slight variation, but another identity in the LGBTQ plus acronym. And then next is transgender. So that's another big umbrella term for you. As you can see, it covers a wide scope of gender identities, which we'll get into in a little bit. And it's a term that essentially covers folks who don't identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Queer, another very big umbrella term, probably the biggest out there, is a term that was historically used with negative connotations, but the LGBTQ plus community has reclaimed it in a really positive and inclusive way. So this is the term that I actually use for my sexual identity, but it also encompasses all identities that fall under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. So you might hear some people even refer to the LGBTQ plus community as the queer community, for example, and I might even use that at some times too. And some people might use the term queer for their sexual and or gender identity. And lastly, the plus covers so many other sexual and gender identities. There's no way that I could cover all of them right now. But some of the actual identities that are covered under there I listed on this slide. So for example, if someone is questioning one of the parts of their sexual identity or gender identity, that's included in the LGBTQ plus acronym. Asexual, which is also referred to as ACE sometimes, and is simply someone who does not experience sexual attraction. And it also exists on a spectrum and can be an umbrella term as well. So that would be covered in the acronym. Pansexual, we spoke about earlier. Demisexual actually describes folks who only experience sexual attraction once they form a strong emotional connection with another person. Intersex is a person who is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit the traditional boxes of male or female, etc. There are so many other identities, like I said, that are covered under that plus sign. And we'll talk about some of them a little later. So hopefully if you have any questions, we'll answer them in the upcoming slides. So first, we're going to examine gender. There's so much to cover about gender. And so just wanted to go over a few basic terms and some basics of gender and what makes up gender identity. So as you can see, assigned at birth simply means the label that doctors or midwives give to infants based on their external genitalia. So you might hear someone use the term AFAB, for example, which means assigned female at birth, or AMAB, assigned male at birth. And we covered the definition of intersex in the last slide, but just here's another reminder on this slide. And so the basics of gender actually come down to 3 dimensions. So the first one would be body, which is our physical bodies, or what gender feels right for us physically, for example. So for example, it could be how society genders our body and how others react to us based on our bodies. So I just said body several times, but that is one of the dimensions of gender. The next one would be social. So that would be our gender expression or the way we present ourselves to the world. So that could be through our hair, our clothes, makeup, lack of makeup, and how the world responds to that presentation. Lastly, we have identity. So identity is the more internal side of our gender and kind of encompasses all of these definitions or dimensions, really. It can also refer to the names we use to convey who we are. So our chosen names, our pronouns, etc. And all 3 of those things together equals gender. So body plus social plus identity equals gender. Gender is not just 1 or 2 of those, it's all 3 of those things together. And then I also want to talk about how sometimes someone might feel uncomfortable, unhappy, or even disconnected with their gender, whether it be with their body, in social situations, or with both. And that feeling is called gender dysphoria, which can really take a toll on people's mental health. And because of that, some folks might decide to transition, which means a person is aligning how they live/present with their gender identity. So this doesn't label someone as transgender. It doesn't suggest a move from male to female or female to male. It's truly just an evolving process. And folks can decide to socially transition from the sex they were assigned at birth and use different gender terms or pronouns or names, and possibly even change legal documents to use their new name. Or they might start to dress differently or change their hairstyle, or they could decide to physically transition and make any changes to their body that felt right. So for example, I recently got top surgery, which is considered a gender affirming surgery. And I believe that there are now 14 types of gender affirming surgeries, which is pretty awesome and inclusive. And that number might have even grown since I last read that. But of course, there are a lot of barriers to transitioning, including finances, family or other relationships, logistics, lack of access to supportive therapists or inclusive healthcare. That's a big one. And then on the opposite side, gender euphoria is when someone's gender identity, body, and social identity or expression is in harmony. And as a reminder, gender is not a choice. It is not about your biological traits, and it's not outwardly obvious. We can't assume someone's gender based on how they look. That's a really important one too, to not make assumptions. So I also just wanted to quickly show you this graphic here that I have on the left of the slide. It's from this organization called the Impact Program, which is an LGBTQ plus program through Northwestern University. I know it's pretty small here on the slide, so when you have access to the slide deck, feel free to click on that link underneath the picture to explore it more yourself. But I really love this gender identity map that they came up with because it's so interactive and you can zoom in on certain aspects you want to learn more about and learn certain terms. And it's a really helpful tool to learn more about gender. So I would highly suggest exploring that link as well. So now we get into gender identities, and historically gender has been thought of as a binary, so male or female, but in reality gender is much more complex. There are cisgender identities, which just means that someone identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth, and transgender, as we've talked about, is when gender doesn't align with the sex assigned at birth. So and non-binary is a gender identity that some folks might claim, including me. And that just means that their gender identity falls outside of the gender binary, and that can mean several different things. But for me personally, I kind of like that the term non-binary is intentionally vague because falling outside of the gender binary can look and feel different for everyone. So some folks who identify as non-binary might just claim that label or use more specific labels that fall under the non-binary umbrella, like gender queer, gender fluid, agender, two-spirit, and so many more. So non-binary is definitely another umbrella term that you'll see too. And you can see the different umbrellas here on the left. So under the trans umbrella, some folks might be assigned male at birth, but identify as a female. So they might use the term trans female or vice versa. And I think I also just wanted to mention that I think I read that in 2014, there were 58 different gender identities that had been identified. Then I read that in 2019, it went up to 64. And then more recently, I've seen some unconfirmed reports that there are 76 gender identities, again, which might be even more now that I'm saying this, which is so awesome. To me, that is so exciting that we have more inclusive language for other gender identities so people can feel more seen. And just as you can see, gender is very complex and probably the coolest, most beautiful way ever. So another big aspect of gender that a lot of people are talking about right now are pronouns. So here on the left is a list of some pronouns that people might use, although it's definitely not comprehensive. So I want to talk about they, them pronouns, which are gender neutral. They can be a singular pronoun and not just about a group of people. They are recognized that way officially in several dictionaries, and they, them pronouns have actually been used as a singular pronoun since the 1300s. And grammatically, you can use it in the same way that you would as if you were referring to a group of people. So this graphic also includes some neo-pronouns, which are pronouns that were developed after the 19th century and usually don't imply any gender. So some examples listed here are je and jure, and there are other ones beyond that too. And just a reminder that folks can use one or multiple sets of pronouns. Like myself, I use they, them, and she, her, but I prefer they, them pronouns. And then pronouns like identities can change and evolve over time. So it's just a gentle reminder that pronouns aren't a preference also. Like our identities, they're a part of who we are and how we express who we are. So, and that can certainly change over time. So as we know, pronouns have been kind of a buzzword recently, and I think they're very important for inclusivity, but I also think they can be tricky because they don't explain someone's full gender identity. Just because someone uses she, her pronouns doesn't necessarily mean they identify as a cisgender female. And just because someone uses they, them pronouns doesn't mean they identify as trans or non-binary. So a great way to ask for someone's pronouns is to actually share your own. That opens up the door for someone to share theirs if they feel comfortable. So you could ask for someone's pronouns, but just don't assume their identity based on what pronouns they use. And if someone asks for your pronouns, you can decide to share them, or you could just say your name, or you could say any identities you want to share. Or you could even say, like, I don't feel comfortable sharing my pronouns, or even I'm still exploring my pronouns, but for now you can call me Maggie or insert your name there. Or sometimes I even say, I'm exploring my pronouns. I'm using they, she right now. I prefer they, but I also identify as non-binary, and I'd love to share that identity with you. I know that's obviously very wordy, but you could basically answer that question whatever way that you feel comfortable. And as just a general rule of thumb, avoid somewhat cringy questions like, what are you? Or are you a boy or a girl? Or even, are you trans? Those could definitely be approached in a much more inclusive, mindful way. Then another thing to note on pronouns is that it's very important to try to use people's correct pronouns. So it's a way to show respect to that person. And if you mess up, that's okay. Mess ups are going to happen. And a great way to handle that is to not necessarily say, I'm sorry, and make a huge deal of it. If you're able to correct it mid sentence, like, oh, her, sorry, that's okay. But I wouldn't make a big scene of it and make it a big apology. And instead, just say thank you and then use their correct pronouns and move on. Because saying sorry can imply that the other person should apologize or feel badly for asking for others to use their correct pronouns. So, and if you'd like, you can always follow up with that person later on too, if you have any clarifying questions or anything like that. But so that's how I would go about using people's correct pronouns and if you mess up. And a great way to practice using pronouns is by using it on pets. So that's actually something that I do with my dog. I'll sometimes use they, them pronouns on with them or with other pets as well. Or even using, your kids' stuffed animals or referring to folks on TV using they, them pronouns, for example. Like that's a great risk-free way to practice pronouns so that you can best show up as an active ally for LGBTQ plus folks. So I always joke that my dog isn't necessarily going to come to me and be like, that's not right. It's just a form of practice. And it's kind of a fun way to do it on a regular basis. And then I also included a link on this slide beneath the graphic to a website where you can also practice using your pronouns on this website. So that's also a valuable tool. And I know I've been talking about pronouns a lot, but lastly, I would just say that, and this is a really important point for me, is to not require students or participants in a workshop, for example, to share pronouns, because it could force someone to come out or face uncomfortable situations or unfair assumptions. So instead, I would suggest making it optional to share. And instead, they can share their name or any identities they'd like to share, like I said. And I can just say personally that pronoun conversations can bring about a lot of stress for me, and that I've changed terms I use for my gender identity a few times in the last couple years, and I've explored different pronouns, and I still don't always feel comfortable with the pronouns I use or sharing my pronouns because it doesn't tell my full story. That's why sometimes I'd rather just ask them to call them by my name, or even share that I identify as non-binary. I also like to try out other chosen names and not use pronouns. Like sometimes I like to use just they, them, and sometimes I like to go by a chosen name that I've started using, Mavi. So long story short, moral of the story is that pronouns do not equal identity. All right, so I know this is a lot of information at once. There is so much to cover on gender, so I really appreciate you sticking with me.